we are celebrating the launch of SEED, but there is a lot of ground under this seed from where the seed is germinating, and that is the Faculty of Environment. There is a lot more going on in the faculty. There are other departments in the faculty that are not only doing things on their own, but they are also very closely and inextricably connected with SEED. Departments such as Environmental Resource Studies, Geography and Environmental Management, and of course our School of Planning. And another very new entity in the faculty, that is the Center for Knowledge Integration, takes it actually all into a whole new realm where complex issues such as the environmental management of our environmental problems and solutions for them, these kind of complex problems have to be solved by bringing knowledge from diverse disciplines together and being able to synthesize into a synthesize these bits of knowledge into a cohesive message and a cohesive solution. We are an integrated faculty, so all these departments and schools and centers, they are very tightly integrated. There's a lot of crosstalk among these centers, and of course there is a lot of crosstalk between the Faculty of Environment and all other faculties. We have joint programs both on the academic side and research side with all other faculties on campus, and that's the role we play on this campus. Among the areas that's highly integrative is development, and today we're going to talk about aspects of development, and related to that is the issue of local versus not so local. And to lead this panel, to coordinate this particular session, I have Larry Swartek, Professor Larry Swartek. He is a professor in our School of Environment, Enterprise and Development. He's also the director of our International Development Program. Larry came to us, well, he first came to the world of academia after finishing his PhD at Dalhousie in international relations, and then he took off to do the real things in the real world. He spent a long period in the trenches of Africa wrestling development problems firsthand, and then he came to us, and he's helping us wrestle those problems now in a different way. Larry, I'll leave it to you from here. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I just want to make a little remark about this seed. You can plant this bookmark, okay? Don't eat it, grow it, okay? It's because I want to point that out, because if you put it in a novel and leave it in a damp place, you might find a sunflower growing out of your out of your book den at some point. I want to build on the first panel. We have an eminent collection of individuals here whose perspectives, interestingly, the way they sit, are going from the global to the hyper-local, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. I framed this in somewhat of a false dichotomy, global versus local. I wanted to put a question mark at the end, but I thought I'd leave that up to the audience to decide whether there is global versus local, or if it's a bit of a false or a bit of a red herring. Dean Saini just mentioned complexity and integration, and I find it a bit ironic that we come to an understanding that this is a more complex world of complex issues that require integration, precisely at the time that we're all twittering madly. And we are fragmented more than ever in terms of our information sources. And I learned the other day that we all suffer from something called continuous partial attention. So, which means you're going to be answering email while you're also listening to us. Huh? So in this, we're in striving for integration and coming to grips with complexity amidst fragmentation, I wonder what filters through. And what filters through, obviously, is a partial story. And we heard some of that some of the complaints about that partial story in the first panel. What comes through is that carbon is the problem, right? It's this obsession with carbon. Along with that is that it's about oil. Somehow, it's tied to oil, and we're not quite sure how that is. Some of us are, and some of us aren't. And what do we do about it? And then the narrative is heavily around countries' responsibilities. How we answer this as a country, as Canada, in competition with other countries. So we end up with this. We must get Canada's house in order. And if we do, well, then it's a matter of getting China and India on side. And some people take it to a further extreme and say, well, this might involve things like buying Canadian, right? Let's just buy Canadian and rein in our consumption to a 100-mile diet, and this will fix us, and then it's a matter of fixing other people. And what results from this is this kind of global versus local discourse. That the problems aren't really ours because we're on top of it. It's the people out there, and it's things outside that come in. And I would rather explore among our panelists here linkages and connections, and to try to come to grips with what is actually local. I'm sorry to say Valerie Chort is not here, because Valerie made a good point to me when I was prepping the panel for this panelists for this panel. And she said, she pointed out to me that at a meeting she was with the South African representative of Woolworths, which is a large retail chain, that getting things like South African orange juice to Canada has a smaller carbon footprint than trucking things from British Columbia all the way over to Nova Scotia. So, what in that case is, how local is Canada then? Or how local is North America? What is local, and how do we understand that? We heard also from the earlier panelists about why should RBC talk about, why should RBC talk, why should they identify the extent of the footprint of their clients? And I would say you should do it because you could show that, in fact, we are the banks. We are the banks. And I think in the same, with the Walmart example, I defy anybody here to show me a piece of clothing that wasn't made, that they're wearing right now, that wasn't made in China or Pakistan or India. So we are China. We are India. And the minister's point about the blue planet, I think, drives that home. That, well, local may be global, and so this is very complex, and that's why I have four very distinguished gentlemen. Unfortunately, just gentlemen. I wish I had a better balance there, but we're all feminized men, I suppose. So we are one sex up here, but we are gender diverse up here. Yeah. Right. So the way I want to go about this is to go from the global to the local. I'm asking each of our presenters here. I'll introduce each one before he talks to restrict his comments to 5 minutes or so. Then we'll open it up for discussion, and if I see people in the audience who really want to get involved, I'll watch the time and see if I can't get some audience participation going here. So let me first turn to Thomas Homer Dixon. Tad, many of you know, is the CG Chair of Global Systems in the Balsillie School of International Affairs. The rest of his bio is here. And I'll just leave it at that. And Tad, please, the floor is yours.
Good. Thank you very much, Larry. I'll make 5 quick points, and I'll begin actually with the issue that you raised in your opening remarks. I think it's a useful device, but I think this distinction between local and global is, in some sense, a false dichotomy. Clearly what we have is a continuum from, say, the global to the local. And The issue for me, I think, in many cases, is the relationship between energy prices and how economies place themselves or settle on that continuum. Speaking very generally, if energy prices go up in aggregate, looking across all energy sources, then global trade declines. The research is actually pretty clear. I was looking for the specific statistic this morning, but it's something like a 10% increase in energy prices produces a 1 or 2% decline in global trade. So you can hypothesize then with reasonable confidence that in a world of much higher energy prices, you would see less material exchange. When I say material exchange, I mean exchange of stuff around the world. There would be a tendency to bring production closer to consumption. And certainly many firms started to make exactly those kinds of decisions. Many firms that had their production apparatus distributed across the planet started to make the decision to bring some of that closer to their consumers during the period of very high energy prices just over a year ago. Now, the thing that we need to focus on then is what are the likely trends with energy prices. And Larry very helpfully in this summary for this session identified two factors that are going to have an enormous effect on energy prices. One is climate change and the likely policies that will develop in order to address climate change, including some kind of carbon pricing. Carbon taxes, cap and trade. We don't know for sure exactly how it's going to unfold, but we will start paying a price for using the atmosphere as a garbage dump for our carbon dioxide. And that will influence the prices of all carbon-based fuels, which currently provide about 80% of the world's energy. The other factor that's going to drive up energy prices is the increasing energetic cost of conventional oil. I don't want to get into a debate about whether peak oil is going to happen. I happen to think that we are probably fairly close within a decade or 15 years to a peak in conventional oil production in the world. But the real issue is that for drillers who are looking for conventional oil, which still provides 40% of the world's commercial energy and 98% of the world's transportation energy, they are having to go farther into more hostile natural environments to drill deeper for smaller pools of lower quality oil. So every extra barrel of oil is harder to get. They have to work harder for it. It takes more energy. And that is going to have an effect on energy prices in general, because as oil becomes energetically more expensive, there will be a tendency to switch into other fuels, and that will tend to drive up the costs of other fuels. So I think the long-term trend is not towards increasing material globalization. In fact, I'd say that with this recent economic crisis, we may have actually seen the apogee of the kind of the form of globalization that we're familiar with, which involves production distributed around the planet, and then tight trade linkages, ships and planes moving all over the place, bringing our food from the other side of the planet, automobiles that are manufactured in 100 different places, the components are manufactured in 100 different places and then assembled somewhere. I think instead we're going to see a disaggregation of the material economy, whether that means a disaggregation down to the level of continents like Latin America, Europe, North America. I'm not so sure. I think it depends fundamentally on how high energy prices go. Remember, the higher the energy prices, the closer you want production to your consumers, because that starts to really become energy starts to become a critical factor of production in terms of driving your costs. But there's an interesting phenomenon here. Information may well still travel entirely globally. So while we have a disaggregation of the global material economy into regions with some linkages between them, but still more regional integration and less global integration, we may continue to see enormous amounts of global integration with flows of information, because information can move around the world with much less energy intensity. It does involve some energy, of course, but not as much as to ship stuff from one side of the planet to the other. So just to conclude, in terms of our personal experiences in coming decades, say my children who are both very young, by the middle of this century. I wouldn't be surprised if they live in communities where a very substantial portion of the goods and services, especially the material goods they consume, are produced within the region or the continent where they're located, where they might travel, if they're North American, once in their lifetimes to a place like Australia, quite likely by sailing ship, high-tech sailing ship. But they'll be in touch with their friends in Australia every day with video communication. Thanks very much.
Very interesting. Thanks for those opening remarks. I'll turn now to Pat Horgan. Pat's the Vice President, Manufacturing, Development and Operations, IBM Canada Limited. Pat?
Thanks, Larry. I'll take a slightly different tack, but I'll touch on some of Tad's remarks around technology. I guess that would be my spot here, I think. On this local versus global, I used to have a sweatshirt that I was quite proud of wearing. I don't know if it was the color or what, but it had a slogan on it, which is quite appropriate, I think, for this discussion, which is think globally, act locally. And I think that's the dichotomy that we're working on. And that's what we see at our company, and that's what we are looking at when we participate on this type of topic. We're a globally integrated company, clearly, but we're very, very proud of what we do here in Canada. So let's start with some of the sub-questions here. You know, as climate change itself, we had Dr. Richard Peltier present to us. He owns this big supercomputer, the largest one in Canada, and he's working on climate models. The net of it is that climate change is a global problem. And net of it as well, with every one of his models, is the atmosphere is quite, and I'm quoting from him, it's quite efficient. So carbon emissions in one part of the world, with trade winds and whatever else technology that he was pointing out in his multiple algorithms, become quite efficient around the world, and they get absorbed around the world. So this is a global problem. Number two, from our point of view, also on the global scale, we did venture out we did a jam technology session on what are the biggest problems out there 3 years ago. And this is a global request, and what do you think the biggest problems are? Technology kind of integrated problems, but mostly just what are the problems? And the environment showed up very, very high on this list. And we've gone away to do some research on that for the last 2 years. And you might have seen that we've come back with this thing called Smarter Planet, a global thought. Smarter Planet is something that says not one part of the world can solve this problem, nor can it be the discussion that we heard earlier that, okay, it's the government's problem, or it's big business's problem, or it's individuals' problem, or it's just one part of the world. It's certainly very complex, and it requires collaboration to solve. And the third thing that's kind of a good thing that's on this think globally, act locally thought is we can find best practices around the world. And I'll use two, maybe three examples here just to give you a sense for you can work on best practices and make a huge difference in a relatively short time, but with trade-offs. So here we go. I'll try. The first one is on utilities, and OPG's, an alumni from OPG is here. But I was able to go across the country last year, and BC Hydro, Ontario Hydro, Quebec Hydro, all feel the same way. The last 10% of the energy that they need is imported, usually on those hottest days in the summer when all the air conditioning's on. And Peter Love from Ontario Hydro said it best, and this is something that's very prevalent here in Kitchener-Waterloo as it is in the rest of southern Ontario, just to take the regional example. When we have to go import that oil, coal plants in Michigan and Ohio Valley there that are mothballed all start up. And they bring this brown cloud, this is his words, this brown cloud sort of shifts up, and on those hot days they just shift enough to center over southern Ontario. So this is a big problem that you start to see in lots of parts of the world, but certainly you can see it here. And it doesn't matter whether you're in cottage country or you're in an urban center, that brown cloud is over top. It also then says, okay, what are we going to do about it? Well, 40% of utilities, I heard Toby say we can lose only 2%, but today, from source to use of utilities, we lose 40% of the hydro use as you power use as you go from source to use. And so smart metering and asking individuals and companies to participate on this is absolutely the right thing to do. In my household, I'm still waiting till tomorrow till I can do dishwashing or clothes washing because it's off the power grid peak. And I think that kind of opportunity with a smart meter on your house or on your business to participate is the right way to go. Number two, another example is on cities. So 50% of the population today of the world problem, live in urban areas. In 20 years, that number will grow to 70% of the world's population will live in urban areas. And a city is a complex set of health, education, energy, traffic. Let me give you an example of Stockholm, who has decided that this gridlock of traffic, they added it up and it was losing, probably it was costing them 40% of their carbon emission for Stockholm, and same kind of, I think it's 45% here in Ontario, comes from gridlock and consumer cars going to and from work. So they said to themselves, we have the technology to be able to put tolls onto people at peak times. However, and by the way, the technology that they had is our 4 and 7 technology, because we developed it and they used it over in Stockholm. They didn't just implement it though. They did, first thing first was a referendum with all the citizens of Stockholm to decide whether this is what they wanted to do, to stop themselves from going downtown at peak times. And it was interesting. You'll see it on YouTube for all the people who want to use all the media. On YouTube, look up Stockholm, you'll find it, and they interviewed people. People decided to vote for, they were thinking longer term. People who decided to vote against, well, they were looking at their pocketbook and saying, today I don't want to afford not going downtown. They did put alternate transit in place. People are riding bikes downtown more often. 1 year to the next, before and after of the gridlock, biggest, would be the 401 here or Conestoga or whatever your center is, from gridlock to free-flowing at peak times. And for them, it saved 22% of the traffic that flows to the city center and 40% of their carbon emissions for Stockholm. So a huge change can happen and can make it happen for everybody. And I think I'll stop there. I will say, if you look at food supply, we had talked about that a little bit earlier. If you can measure where farm to fork happens, that is a local issue. And it is something that actually, I heard a stat that the average carrot in Idaho travels 1,600 miles to get there. And by the way, 20% of that load comes bad because it's come so far and it's come across hot places. So you can monitor things a lot more to be able to become more efficient as well as you go through this. So there's some thoughts to throw out there. It is global problems. We can see major problems that are shared around the world, but you have to act locally and you have to ask yourselves, how do I get engaged?
Okay, thanks a lot for those opening remarks. There's a couple of things there that I want to sort of pick up on later. One is the best practice. So what I always tell my students, that there are so many problems that the possibilities for improvement are endless. So just pick a point, enter, and you can make things better. But what are key entry points? And I'll ask everybody to come back to that. The second one is, you just raised about food, and I want to come back to that also. About Tad talked about material deglobalization and what can be localized without sort of massive disruptions to social forces, for example. Right? Okay, thank you for that. Now I'll turn to Jim McArdle, who he's the Senior Vice President, Legal Services and Secretary of Export Development Canada. So to say that we must be local would put Jim out of a job pretty darn quickly. Jim, the floor is yours.
I think you've given me a little foreshadowing of where I'm going to end up going. I'm sure you don't want to hear a lawyer talk to you today, so really I'm here because I'm responsible for CSR at our corporation as well, and I have the environmental assessment team under me, the corporate responsibility team, work with the human rights side. And as well, I have the good fortune to be the acting president when our president's traveling, so I get to be involved in very, very many decisions that are the tough ones that get very to the top. So it's kind of a fun position. EDC, Export Development Canada, is the export credit agency for Canada. Don't know how many of you know of us. We're often told we're Canada's best kept secret. We try to help exporters and investors in Canada succeed globally, both by doing production here and by going offshore to do whatever they have to do to succeed, to bring wealth back to Canada and benefits back to Canada. I'm going to look at it from a bit more of an economic point of view. I have been able to speak at length with our chief economist on a number of these issues. And so I'm going to focus on sort of three questions. Do we need to go local? Do we want to go local? Sort of can we? And is it actually better to go local from a sustainability perspective, from a high level perspective on that? And some of mine, my economist's views are somewhat different than Thomas's, but that's what makes the world interesting. He was telling me about a book which I have not read, but he did, by Jeff Rubin. He used to be the chief economist at CIBC. It's called Why the World is About to Get a Lot Smaller, and his thesis is $200 a barrel oil, and how it will change us and make us a lot closer to each other and have to go local. And that thesis, our chief economist thinks he's got the supply and the demand curve assumptions for that wrong, and sort of spent a lot of time with me explaining why was that. So on the demand side, he used previous examples, 1970s when oil spiked. Consumer behavior changed a lot. Our choices changed a lot. The R&D changed a lot. And that really caused a lot of the demand for oil and energy to go down. Obviously last year when oil I think peaked at $147 a barrel, we probably all stopped using our car a little bit more. We started thinking about, how can we even help our pocketbook a little. So he thinks there are many things that can happen on the demand side that will happen as the price of oil creeps further north, and it will actually shrink the amount that we need around the world, even with China and India, etc., growing and growing. On the supply side, oil prices are obviously tremendously volatile. He reminded me, I have a short memory, he reminded me in 1998, and I have to believe this, oil was $10 a barrel. And people were worrying about it going down to $5 a barrel and what was going to happen when it was at $5 a barrel. Obviously, 2008, $147. Right now, 50, 60, 70, depending on the day, depending what the arbitrage people are doing with it. But right now, we have a glut of oil, actually. There is estimated to be 100 million barrels of oil floating in the ocean because we don't have any more storage on land for it. OPEC nations have cut back 5 million barrels a day to try to keep the price at least stable. So in his view, even on the longer term view, he does not see even today there's no fundamentals for the price of oil as it stands right now, and he hasn't even started to think about, well, we have so much gas that we're discovering that we're not using, and it's obviously a really easy alternative. In addition, if oil did creep back up into the $100 range, we've seen it before, it would happen again. It really gets a lot of people excited. It obviously gets the oil companies excited because now they can look for that oil that may be a little more difficult and more costly. But more particularly, it's the innovation and R&D that it drives. It drives people to be more efficient, to develop more efficient engines, to develop more efficient ways of moving things. Our logistics models would change. For example, there are a lot of containers floating around in the ocean. They're not full. We're not maximizing our container ships. We're not maximizing how to lower transportation costs because we don't really have to yet. So all of that comes together as, do we need to go local? Is oil going to drive us to have to go local? And his view is, no, not really. And so as a result, he thinks the world will continue to look and search for the lowest cost of inputs, be it raw materials or labor and various other things, wherever it is in the world, wherever it's the cheapest but can deliver the quality that's needed for your product. And so the supply chain that we focus on a lot, because Canada plays a part of that supply chain, we think is going to remain globalized. We also think that globalized trade has been and will continue to be really good for Canada, our economy and our standard of living. Local trade, if we went really back to local trade, it would not sustain Canada's economy from our views. And we really have been and always will be, I think, an exporting nation. We've always exported the raw materials, potash and agriculture, but also manufacturing, and more recently, much more skilled labor, technology, services, engineers that are going around the world and sharing the expertise that we have here. Obviously, we don't have low-cost labor, and so people are looking for that somewhere else. But we do have a lot to offer, and we think we really have to offer that around the world to sustain where we are as a company or as a country. we participate in global trade at all levels, from the top to the bottom, and we kind of look at it as integrative trade. So some examples for the top would be easily neighborhood here, RIM with the BlackBerry. Great Canadian invention, huge R&D, but it's actually has 8 different countries that supply source material for it, and that's the way they were able to do it, and it's the best way to do it and the cheapest way to do it for them. But it hasn't really hurt Canada because the R&D is still happening here, and those highly skilled jobs remain here and help our economy. Another example, Bombardier, which does the RJ, the regional jets that probably everyone's flown on. It's only got about 30 to 35% Canadian content. The landing gear is built in Ireland, there's pieces of it built all over the world, and they bring it back to Mirabel in Montreal to put it together, and it brings back wealth to Canada. In the middle tier, easy example is in the automotive sector, parts suppliers, big ones like Magna, but little ones like toolers that are all around Cambridge and Waterloo, A.G. Simpson and Woodbridge Foam. And they start with GM and Chrysler and the Detroit 3 here, but as they get good and get connected into that supply chain, the manufacturers, the top manufacturers, say we want to build a plant in Alabama or somewhere, and we need the sort of the dashboard foam, for example. It has to be built very close to the place where the assembly happens, and so they put a plant, and it's a Canadian plant that moves down there, and we bring our technology and production down there. Wealth flows back to Canada. And the very bottom of the chain is the SMEs, the small and medium-sized companies that really do play a huge part of Canada's economy. I think we were talking yesterday that over 85% of the companies in Canada are small and medium-sized, and they have to fit into the supply chain somewhere, and they find their niche and participate in that global trade through those niches. So we really think globalization has made the Canadian economy what it is. And we don't think we'd be able to stop it and become global even if we wanted to. Other economies are growing much faster than Canada. If we don't participate in those, we're gonna lag behind everyone else from a standard of living. And the other economies that have benefited so much from globalization by allowing us to use their labor and things like that, they don't want to go back. They're going to continue to offer their services to others around the world. And if we go totally global, we're not going to be able to compete. So really, we think we have to remain there. Now, globalization and sustainability, I don't think they're necessarily at odds. Our experience is that multinationals bring their good CSR, bring their good practices with them around the world. International financiers, including ourselves, have very high standards for companies, and we really do impose those on the companies and force them to meet their standards. So it's almost good when a foreign company wants to borrow money internationally because they're going to have to come up to the standards we want them. And the foreign nations and companies are generally far less efficient than ourselves in our usage of energy. So we really have to help them get better. If we were to close our borders in effect and go local, they would never benefit from some of the technology that we develop and other places around the world have developed, so that we can actually help them get better and help the world's sort of environment and sustainability come up to this place where we need it. So wrapping up, our view is we don't need to go local. We don't actually want to go local, and we probably couldn't even if we wanted to. And we actually don't think that it's actually bad for sustainability to remain globalized.
Thanks a lot. As the European football commentators would say, there's a lot of talking points there. So from SMEs to SMEs, small and medium enterprises, we're now moving over to Paul Polak, who's more the small, medium, and micro enterprises. Paul is he's underexplained here as the founder of International Development Enterprises. Paul is an innovator par excellence, and his focus is on the other 90% of humanity that generally doesn't get consulted in any of these meetings, that is the poor, especially the poor farmers. Also, they're the ones who, at a hyper-local level, are generally impacted by every sort of decision that we take, whether it's to go global or to go local. The impacts of these sorts of decisions are felt at a hyper-local level around the world. So I've got Paul here to speak for the other 90%, I hope. And the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. Not only are the people in the other 90% impacted, but their lives profoundly impact all of the issues we've been discussing. They probably, they will contribute virtually all of the 3 billion new people that we expect on the planet in 25 years. And that has a profound implication for all the things we're talking about. When I think of the theme, global versus local, I think of grapes on the shelves of Loblaws in winter. Or I think of, would it really be possible to build a micro car factory in the hills of Nepal the size of this room? Probably not, but then I don't think automobiles are sustainable in the global context anyway. I guess I'd like to focus my 5 minutes on what is and what can be. A central part of what is, from my perspective, is a global recession triggered by, to a large extent, by large and small businesses competing with each other to survive, serving only 10% of the world's customers. Worst of all, that recession is based to a large part on obscene overconsumption by that richest 10%. And our efforts to come out of the recession, stimulated by government programs, are to a large extent looking to come back to that overconsumerism, which contributes disproportionately to carbon emissions and is financed by too much foreign credit. So what is a way of dealing with this and dealing with this productively? As I said before, and as you said in the introduction, most of the discussion today has been focused on the richest 10% of the world's customers. It's about our culture and what we can do about the environment and business within our culture. Our culture, we are part of North America and Europe, which represents the richest 10% of the world's customers. But the real problems of now and the future for the preservation of the planet are in the other 90%. And in my view, the most important determinants of that are in the 40% of the people on the planet today who live on less than $2 a day. That is 2.4 billion customers. I think it's provocative to me that all of the companies in the world now, big and small companies, are focusing pretty much on the richest 10% of the world's customers, and so are the world's designers. To me, there are at least 100 Henry Ford-sized opportunities for new businesses that are profitable, serving the other 90%. There are 1 billion people in the world who don't have access to safe drinking water. They are motivated and interested in access to safe drinking water at a price of about 4 cents a day. That is an opportunity for a global business. Canada could take the lead in a business like this. There are 1 billion people who will never connect to the electric grid. We talk about electricity. There are opportunities to create radically affordable energy technologies combined with radically decentralized private sector supply chains that will serve these customers and make a profit. There are about 800 million people in the world who need eyeglasses and don't have them. A tailor who has presbyopia, the old person's disease of needing arm extenders to read. If you're a tailor and you can't see anymore, you're out of business. those people, if you could come up with a business that would globally distribute $2.50 eyeglasses that allow people to pick eyeglasses that fit their degree of presbyopia, just like most of you in the audience have spare eyeglasses that you bought in a drugstore for 10 or 12 bucks. You could set up a company that would make those eyeglasses available for $2.50 to the 800 million people who don't have them now. There are about 1 billion people in the world who would love to have a $100 house that has both market and loan value. Those are the kind of customers that are the basis of business of the future. And if large and small businesses could begin to enter these virgin markets, not for social good, but because there's a huge missed profit in that whole arena, it would bring $500 million a day people out of poverty, because one of the main reasons that poverty persists is that poor people don't have access to markets. And bringing $500 million a day people out of poverty would profoundly impact things like population growth and things like the fact that people, when we have disasters and people are starving, it's the reverse of the grapes on the shelves in Loblaws. Just calculate the cost of the energy to bring all of the food in large container quantities to people who are starving in a disaster or a refugee crisis. And you see what kind of impact on the environmental problems we're talking about is made right now by the 90% of the people in the world who are bypassed by current business and by current design.
Thanks so much for that. All right, I've got about 10 common themes from 4 presentations. And I think the last one is I'm going to start off there, but I mean, I think it's obvious that the global is local and the local is global. I also think that what you're hearing here is that, well, we hear different messages, partially that we can't go back, we being Canada. But you also hear things that, for example, that there may be some things that need to be globalized that would have a minimal footprint that would have a local benefit. You know, like Paul's notion of $2 eyeglasses, perhaps, I don't know. So I want to throw it open first. Well, let me just run through this list, but then I see everybody's been writing notes here, and I'll turn it over to them. But what I'm looking at here is I'd like to hear more about sort of, you know, if we can't go back, then give me hard examples of how we go forward in a mutually beneficial way. Okay, and then I want to have a bit of a discussion about, you know, what does it actually mean to be globalized or deglobalized? You know, what would utterly fail from the, you know, $200 barrel of oil? You know, what kind of production processes would just collapse utterly? You know, and where would Canada be in all of that? At the same time, what inevitably must be globalized? Knowledge, I suppose, is what we've heard a little bit. What can we deglobalize to the benefit of everybody? You know, what do we trade? Is it, you know, containers full of garlic from China? Must that just stop? You know, what can we safely deglobalize to the benefit of everybody? Who's going to, you know, how do we do that? You know, who's the regulator in all of this? How do we have that conversation? We need laws, we need monitoring, we need standards, we need, you know, process. How do we do that? And I guess that takes us in some ways to what I would call the fear of being the first mover. Okay, we talked about we're a first mover with seed, but we often see the fear of being the first mover. We don't want to be first with climate change because we lose competitive advantage vis-a-vis others who don't take a step. So, given that sort of, the regulators don't want to move, who moves? And then oftentimes it comes back to the market. So if we could have some kind of conversation around that, I think that would be quite useful. I'll come back to Tad to kick things off, round 2.
Well, there is an enormous amount on the table here, but I think I will just respond to some of Jim's comments, because we really do have a disagreement. And I think it's an important disagreement.
Talking points, not disagreement.
It's a disagreement. It's a disagreement. It's an important disagreement. And what I'm going to say is said with all due respect to Jim and his interlocutors and his conversations with people. But a lot's going to ride on what happens with energy prices. I think this is going to be, in many respects, energy will be a determinative factor in the course of human civilization this century. So let me just break the issue, and I'll try to make this as quick as possible because we've got a lot else to talk about, and break the issue into the 2 parts that Jim raised, demand and supply. I think you're right that higher prices will lead to demand destruction. But that demand destruction may be mostly located in wealthy countries. I think that the price elasticities of demand in countries like rapidly industrializing countries like India and China are actually quite low, especially for people who are entering the middle class and who want things like small cars. And I think this is one of Jeff Rubin's most persuasive arguments, that there will be continued upward pressure on demand for transportation energy, oil, conventional oil, if it's available, especially from the powerhouse developing countries like India and China, Indonesia to a lesser extent. But I'd like to focus most of what I'm going to say here on the supply side, and here we need to focus on some physical facts, and because they're actually kind of inescapable. The first is something that was recognized by the International Energy Agency last fall, exactly a year ago, in its World Energy Report, the 2008 World Energy Report. They did a survey of 800 oil fields around the world, and they looked at the ones that were post-peak production and declining. Now, up to that point, the assumption had been that the post-peak decline rate was, on average, around 4%. And they determined that it was actually 6.7% around the world, so approaching 7%. That really had an enormous effect on the debate about this subject. Because if we reach a peak global oil production and then go into decline of somewhere around 6 to 7% a year, that will really shake things up in terms of the availability of conventional oil. Remember that up into the recession, we had peaked in terms of global oil production at around 85 million barrels a day, and it had stayed there for 3 years, which is the first time that's ever happened, where we've actually plateaued. That was one of the things that contributed significantly to the oil price spike. So there's some evidence that we're starting to push against the ceiling. The second thing that I'd like to say, so the first point, the first fact, is that post-peak decline rates around the world are at over 6%, approaching 7%. The second fact is the increasing energy cost of energy. And I didn't mention these statistics, but very quickly, in the 1930s in Leduc in Alberta and Texas, big oil finds in Texas, you got about 100 barrels of oil back for every barrel of oil of energy you invested to drill down into the ground and get oil out. Now, in the United States and in Canada, the energy return on investment for conventional oil is around 17 to 1. For the tar sands, it's around 4 to 1. For corn-based ethanol, it's around 1 to 1, which means you put about as much energy in as you get out. It's a great subsidy for farmers, but it's a terrible energy technology. We'll come back, I'll mention in a moment what coal and natural gas, but the fact remains that for a critical energy source, there's a physical reality that is becoming harder to get. You have to work harder to get it. And then the third fact is that on an annual basis, globally, we are consuming around somewhere between 3 and 10 times as much oil as we're discovering. So we consume on an annual basis around 30 billion barrels, and we discover over the last few years sometimes 3 billion barrels, sometimes 5 billion barrels. This year it's been a very good year, 10 billion barrels, but that's still only a third of what we're consuming on an annual basis. Now we can do that for a while because we can use up reserves that were discovered many decades ago in places like Saudi Arabia. But sooner or later, no matter how clever we are at expanding those reserves and finding smaller pockets within those already discovered reserves, sooner or later, that piggy bank is going to exhaust itself. Now, I don't want to take too much time, but there are these alternatives of coal and natural gas. Coal, of course, is very dirty from a carbon point of view, and so in a carbon-constrained world, it's not clear that's going to be an easy alternative. There may be a lot of natural gas around. Shale gas has changed the profile of natural gas dramatically in the last 2 or 3 years. But there's some real questions about the sustainability of shale gas. The decline rates for shale gas wells are 2 to 3 times higher than the decline rates for conventional wells. So we just have to keep our conversation here informed about some of these very critical facts. I just say, in concluding here, that I think it's quite surprising that in the middle of a very, very severe recession, we saw oil prices drop from obviously a highly inflated peak, a spike of $147 a barrel. But the lowest it ever got to was $38 a barrel, and now it's back up around $80 a barrel. I'm actually quite surprised at how resilient in the middle of a very serious recession oil prices have been, and partly because of the decline in the American dollar, but also because of underlying fundamentals, the price is starting to creep back up as the world economy starts to recover. And the final thing I'd say is that even independently of our discussion about the fundamentals of oil and energy and whether energy prices will be higher in the future, there is another factor that I mentioned that's going to drive up energy prices for carbon-based energy, and that's carbon pricing. And that's going to happen. And we're looking probably somewhere down the line at prices in the neighborhood of not Alberta's $15 a ton for carbon emissions, but $50, $100, maybe ultimately $200 a ton. That is going to have an enormous effect on energy prices in general. And we don't have any obvious alternatives on the scale required for carbon-based energy around the world right now. Remember, it's 80% of the energy we use. So energy prices are going to go up relative to other things. I think it's absolutely inescapable, an outcome that we will see over the next few decades. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Ted. There's kind of a cognitive disconnect. What's the basis for this? We've got, and I think most of us understand the basic facts, right? I don't think it's revolutionary what you've just said. I think we all know that, right? But then we sort of take that and we put it over here somewhere, and then we sort of, Canada must be global and a global actor, and all of this stuff. How do we bridge that gap? How do we get a better language?
Let me just say one other thing very quickly, and it's only in one sentence. It's really important to understand that what I'm saying is not a normative argument. I actually like globalization. I like being able to get mangoes from India, and I've traveled in 60 countries, and I've benefited a lot from the availability of enormous quantities of almost free energy that we've had in the last century. My argument is one that's based in the facts on the ground of the trends that I'm seeing. I'm not particularly sure that the world that we're going to evolve into with much higher energy prices is one that will be desirable. But I think it's, in some respects, one that's inevitable.
Okay. Yes, Paul. Jim, you want to have an immediate I resist this sort of...
Either way. I can wait.
Okay. Paul...
We won't go into a big back and forth.
Okay. Paul, please.
So I may quickly be assuming the maverick role in this discussion, but let me place the discussion on energy into what I consider to be a global context. The impact of high oil prices on the 40% of people who live on less than $2 a day. It's important, but most of the manufactured goods that the energy is used to produce are too expensive for these people to buy. They use buses, so high energy prices will affect bus fares. But let's look at energy from the point of from the viewpoint of most of the people in the world. The 40% that live on less than $2 a day aren't using a car, they aren't using a motorcycle, they're too expensive, they're walking. So there's energy in what they, in the food they eat, but a lot of them don't have enough food. So there's a real problem there in that kind of personal energy. On the other hand, they use energy a lot for cooking and for heating. And they're using wood. Wood is the real huge energy source for this population. And wood is becoming scarce in the hills of Nepal. Some of the hills are being denuded, which leads to erosion and flooding, which leads to some of the disasters that we spend more energy bringing food to. There is a real need for more efficient stoves, but they have to be really affordable because these people can't afford the expensive stoves. You get the drift of what I'm talking about. Energy for most of the people in the world is very different than the energy issues we're concerned about, which is oil prices.
I just so that I'm not going to be a maverick, I'm going to follow Paul's line here. So, so I talked about this, what are the 10 big problems in the world, right? And we talked about the environmental one because that's what we've been talking about. And I'll try to get in the middle of you two guys here in a second. But actually, one of the other ones, developing countries around the world, Africa, and others immediately centered on what you're talking about. And so we've stepped up, and I think other companies are seeing what we're doing, and we're doing it not for a profit motive. So I will just move away from saying it isn't. I remember there's a famous Canadian story of Thomas Bata that looked at Africa and said, hey, they're all barefoot. Great profit opportunity for me, and it turned out that didn't work for him. In our case, what we're doing is we're sending 600 people, the best and the brightest. It's a big competition. I'm on the board of it. And I'm actually sending one of my best people. I have to suck this up and say, yes, you can go. It's a 6-month journey where they take a sabbatical and they go to a third world country. And they actually then can work with the not-for-profits and the problems that you're talking about, clean water, just the basics. But they're not there for just tell. Sometimes they're smart enough to help a little bit, but they are listening a lot. There's a lot more that can be gained, and leaving sustainable economy behind is kind of the point. How can you, by growing this way, help this big problem? It's a massive problem. You can't just invest in it and say it's going to work. On the other hand, for us, it's a huge benefit on the people that are back on the ground when they come back, and we've seen it. Their perspective is now global in a sustainable way, in a different way than they ever were before. It's not, I also have a big passport with stamps of 35 or 40 countries. This is a totally different way of looking at it, and I think you should take a look to see and maybe encourage other companies to try this on, because it's a talent, skills point. I think Larry's background fits this quite well as well. I will make one other thing. It doesn't have to be just peak oil that causes us to move from complacency. I think it's complacency, honestly. We hear about Canada, and we're very proud of our country. We're very proud of our country. And we're a little bit complacent about what we have around us, as though it's always going to be. The example I'll use is just take global competition in a real way. I have a manufacturing plant, the biggest microelectronics plant in Canada. It works in my group. They get every day, they wake up every day and think about what do they have to do. Sorry, Frank, for the earlier, I'm going to even go. Innovation is really not a thought that is an esoteric thought. If they don't do it better at a lower cost in a more innovative way tomorrow, they will not keep that plant open. And so we have to step up to look at nanotechnologies in the future. They are looking at, and they're doing fantastic things. In fact, any gaming device comes, if you have a PlayStation or a Wii or an Xbox, the chip inside says made in Canada. as it comes from our IBM plant. So, but I'm making the point that had nothing to do with oil prices. That had to do with I have to wake up every day and understand it's a global competition and I have to win. And I think that's a slightly different point. It moves away from just the arbitrage on oil. It certainly, I agree with you, it's going to be more expensive in the future, and we should just, maybe that'll move us off complacency, but complacency is the issue.
I'm not going to fight with that, but I will after. Because we do agree on some things, and that is, the most important one is that a lot rides on energy price, and it has been a rise, even if it's just carbon pricing added to it. You know, there are a lot of other flip sides to it, but I do agree that a lot rides on the price of energy, and I also agree with Pat in terms of we're going to have to make choices. We have to decide if we're going to do something to help Canada stay where it is, and it can be either through innovation with a plant, but it can also be how much energy are we using, what are we prepared to do to companies that don't respond. If we keep buying grapes from somewhere, well, they're going to keep supplying them to us. If we don't like that, then we have the power to change it. We can't look to government, we can't look to the banks. We heard a bit of that the other time. It's us. We have to make that decision. And when we do that, we have a huge power. So I really think there's a piece that we have to keep that in mind. There was one comment you made earlier, changing it a bit, and that would be, what would Canada be like at $200 oil? And we've seen a bit of an example of that when I went to 147, and our economists described that as we had our feet in the freezer and our head in the oven, because Alberta and BC were going crazy, and Quebec and Ontario and the East Coast were doing terribly. And I think in the short term, that's what would happen, because it takes a while to react to changes like that, and R&D would have to pick up. So Canada would look different, at least for a while. I think in the long term, our skills and our technology and universities like this will help us smooth that out. But I think for the short term, it would be a very different country.
That's a great observation, because it says, what is Canada? You know, I mean, part of the problem is that impacts are unequally felt, and so it's hard to get a consensus on some of these things. You know, when we're talking about complacency, usually we say, well, how do you overcome complacency? Well, you know, generally it's you raise the price, right? That forces you to pay attention, or somehow the government will regulate this, right? Now, keeping in mind what Paul had said, and also you mentioned, is that, you know, if the market is a solution for, I don't know, rich countries, the market also, you know, if you remember how Africa got into its present crisis, it started with OPEC 30 years ago, and also a floating US dollar. So, you know, we were shaken and survived, but these countries have never, you know, they'll be bankrupted by $200 oil, for example. The run to biofuels is, you know, led to a turn away from food production, and you know, and where third world countries are having to privatize land, you know, big producers see opportunities with biofuel, and they buy up land, and they're, you know, it's biofuels for the world, and there's no food production locally, so the local people don't get anything. So there's, you know, so it's not like a market solution, is my point. That will sort of sort out the world. It may help us Canadians think our way through things, but as far as some kind of global panacea, I don't see it. Ted?
Well, you asked something interesting before, Larry. You said, do we have to go back? And I want to just put a question mark after going back, because it sort of implies, again, thinking in terms of our continuum, that we have local and global, and we can move ourselves up and down this continuum, and we've been way up towards the global end, and we have to go back down this continuum. But actually, maybe we should be thinking about going somewhere else. And that maybe, although it's an important device, and it's the way people think in terms of local and global, lots of conversations about this, maybe rather than whether we're globalized or localized or whatever mixture we have, we should be thinking in terms of things like system resilience. Now, and just pick up on what Paul was saying and what you just said about biofuels, because we have a global food system that is remarkably unresilient. We had a really serious price spike just over a year ago. There were riots and violence in 60 countries around the world. And it was actually directly related to energy prices, oil prices, because as oil prices went up, we saw increased incentive to grow biofuels. Land was taken out of production that would have otherwise grown crops for biofuels, and that had an effect on world food prices. And it's now estimated by people who've done the research that about 30% of that price increase was caused by a shift of land into biofuels. Now, that is an example of a globalized system that wasn't working, and that hurt a lot of people. And it may be just the leading edge of a food crisis that could continue as the world population, as you said, moves to 9 billion people this century. We have climate change, more difficult growing environment for many crops, and we have a tightly coupled global food system that can produce cascading shocks that affect the poorest people very severely. The poorest 40% who live on $2 a day or less. Now, I think if maybe the debate about global versus local actually doesn't help us focus on what's important. Instead, we should be focusing on developing food systems, energy systems, production systems that aren't vulnerable to cascading failures when there's a shock of some kind, when, say, energy price suddenly spikes. You don't suddenly have a big problem in the global food system, too.
Absolutely. That's, and I think that's sort of the message that I was hoping that we would sort of convey, is that, yeah, it's not global versus local, although we seem to be stuck with that discourse for some reason. And I'm still not hearing how we sort of, how you get your message into a policy structure where it has a discernible impact and an output that we can then say, okay, this is, we're moving in a sustainable direction, as opposed to be more complacent. Maybe it has something to do with the fact that the people who are least affected and most resilient are at the top. You and I will always be fine. So we can afford to be complacent, perhaps. Paul, you wanted to say something?
I just wanted to say that one of the real opportunities for local is that I've spent 28 years working with 1-acre farmers that live on $1 a day in Asia and Africa. They are remarkable survival entrepreneurs. Their capacity to be entrepreneurial is huge, and we've barely tapped that. So there are huge opportunities for them. They are ready to invest in income-generating opportunities, opportunities to grow crops that feed themselves, but also crops that they can put into the marketplace that are higher value. I think one of the things that is a problem with, we've focused a lot on energy in the discussion. I think the prices are screwed up. They don't really reflect the true cost. When you have prices that reflect the true cost, that brings balance much more effectively than policies in my experience. So in Switzerland, for instance, where one of your faculty is coming from, they have a much more balanced transport system with cars and trains and boats. But part of it is that there's a more realistic cost on owning a car and driving it. And so people tend to take the train, and they have a much more efficient train system and bus system. So the market really does shape a lot of things if you get the prices right. I think maybe the price of grapes is not right.
Okay, I've got a note here that says we have to wrap up, and in order to do that, I'd like to just give you all a last free swing. I'll start with Jim. I'll let him swing first, and then you can run if you wish.
I'm not going to swing. All I'm hoping is we don't have grapes for lunch, I hope, anyway. No, I'm going to do a tiny bit of an advertisement almost, and that's if somebody wants to start up a business to sell eyeglassware for $2.50 around the world and they're Canadian, come on over, we'll see if we can lend you some money. I think it's a great idea. I mean, we all think of the baby boomers and how many businesses built themselves around that the bulge in the snake that everyone said in the Python. There's an obviously similar thing with millions and billions of people around the world, and if Canadians want to tap into it, that's pretty exciting.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, and that speaks to what could you globalize to mutual benefit with minimum kind of footprint, perhaps. Yeah? Pat?
Well, since we're making advertising, thanks. No, actually, I do have a thought. We just used Stockholm as an example of a city. Actually, next Tuesday, you can freely sign up to a Smarter Cities conference in Toronto. And it's not an IBM logo thing. We're not selling anything. We're actually bringing government, all constituents together in one place that own all of those systems that interact for a chance to kind of make a statement to not be complacent in Canada. Why do we wait until we see everybody else leave the station, if it will? And London, England signing up, New York City signing up, and we're trying to get urban cities in Canada and the people around that influence it. And it's almost to your question, how do we get started? So, it's a way to collaborate and get the ideas across that are necessary to move to the future. I do also want to just say to the SEED program here, both panels, I'd have to say, reflect the great interdisciplinary schooling that you're going to get, or you're getting. It's absolutely connected. There's no single silo here of engineering or environmental concerns or urban planning or business that can be separate. It has to be together, and I think this is a great faculty and opportunity for the people who are associated with this. So I really applaud what you're doing.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'm going to. 20 years in Africa taught me a respect for elders, so I have to give Tad the penultimate word, saving the last word for someone else.
Well, I'll continue with the advertising theme. I think that we all agree on this panel that there are some monumental changes coming. We may not agree on exactly what they might look like because the future is full of unknown unknowns and enormous uncertainty. But these changes will create a very exciting time. And I think the new school is exactly the kind of enterprise we need, a place we need to encourage the innovation and entrepreneurship and new thinking to help us build a resilient world.
Thank you. And last but certainly not least, Paul.
I guess I get the last shot because I'm at the point where my age and IQ have crossed. I would just say that if anybody wants to start that eyeglasses business, that's not a theoretical thing, and it perhaps is an example of where global and local can cross. You can get a whole range of the same eyeglasses that you buy in the drugstore in mainland China for 50 cents a pop. But now you've got to design an effective, radically decentralized delivery mechanism, like a peddler's cart that represents the rack that you see and maybe has some other items where you can go to rural areas. And the difference between the 50 cents and the 250 is enough to be profitable. So that's a real possibility, but it will take combining creatively global and local.